In this lesson, we will be talking about the United States going from isolationism to involvement in World War II. Our essential question is, what events led the U.S. to abandon isolationism and enter the war? So first, let's talk a little bit about what's going on over in Europe. After World War I, France had built the Maginot Line. This was a line of strong fortifications. We can see here some of the Maginot Line, huge concrete structures with weaponry, and they built it along their border with Germany. All right, basically they were tired of being invaded by Germany, and the Maginot Line was an attempt to prevent that from ever happening again. So right here we can see that this is where the strong fortifications of the Maginot Line are, but they stop right here because the French didn't figure that Germany would invade them through the Ardennes forest, and that's exactly what they did. So after Germany lays dormant for a few months after the invasion of Poland, in the spring of 1940, they launch super sudden quick attacks known as Blitzkrieg in several countries across Europe, including France. Let's talk about the fall of France first. Those slides are out of order. Once Germany invades France, the Battle of France only lasts 1.5 months, 6 weeks. France is forced to surrender to Germany in the same railroad car where Germany had surrendered in 1918 at the end of World War I. So basically this was Hitler being petty. Obviously done as revenge for the way that the Germans were treated at the end of the First World War. The ceasefire between France and Germany included provisions where France would be divided into two sections. Occupied France would be in the northern section, controlled by Germany as a station for German troops. And the southern section of France would be left to the French people to run their own way, to have all of their government business done. That became known as Vichy France because the de facto capital of France became the city of Vichy in that southern area. They were officially neutral, but they collaborated with the Germans and with the Nazi government. Within both Vichy and occupied France, there were resistance movements called Free France that continued to stand up against Hitler and the spread of fascism. The rescue at Dunkirk was honestly a World War II miracle. After the fall of France, the German forces had hundreds of thousands French and British troops trapped against the English Channel. The troops were located in France, and it looked as if they had no way to escape from the advancing German troops. Due to some German tactical mistakes, 338,000 French and British troops were able to escape across the English Channel back over into Great Britain. Dunkirk is so significant because if Germany had not made these mistakes and they had succeeded in trapping these troops, Great Britain most likely would have not been able to stay in the war, which means that the war in Europe would have been over much faster than it was, with a completely different outcome with a German victory. There was a new movie that just came out about this recently that you may have seen, and if not, maybe give it a watch. So here is a picture of the French surrender in 1940 in that railroad car. Reactions of some of the French people upon seeing the Nazi soldiers marched through their cities, and Adolf Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower. So this map shows us the extent of German expansion across Europe. Pretty soon they are going to also invade the Soviet Union, which turns the Soviet Union against the Germans to join the Allied side. But we can see that there's not many democratic countries left to stand up to Nazi Germany. Really, there's just Great Britain. Over in the Pacific, this is the extent of Japanese expansion. So let's talk about the Battle of Britain. After the fall of France, Hitler sets his sights on Great Britain. His plan to invade Great Britain is referred to as Operation Sea Lion. He first plans to destroy Great Britain's Air Force by using the German Air Force. The German Air Force is called the Luftwaffe. So the Battle of Britain became an air battle, and the most infamous air battle in world history. The Battle of Britain consisted of several months of heavy bombing that was known as the Blitz, short for Blitzkrieg. The goal was to terrorize Great Britain into surrendering, to fall just the way that France had in a little over a month. This does not happen with Great Britain. The British people continue their day-to-day lives, even with the constant and horrific bombing. If you've seen those Keep Calm and Carry On posters, those were World War II propaganda to just continue, pushing on in the face of conflict. Hitler is eventually forced to give up on Operation Sea Lion, and he never again attempts to invade the British Isles. All right, Operation Sea Lion is postponed indefinitely. So here are the air forces, some of the planes from those air forces. This is the German plane. We see the Nazi symbol. And then this is the British Air Force. During the Battle of Britain, many Londoners would move to the underground to sleep at night where they would be safe from the bombing. We see here a bombed out library, and this was, pretty much the example of Britons just continuing to live their day-to-day life, even throughout the midst of these air bombings. Some of the damage from the Battle of Britain. Over here in the United States, we are beginning to edge towards war. Great Britain is trying their hardest to get us to enter the war. They're afraid that they won't be able to hold the Germans off much longer. In early 1941, FDR gives his Four Freedoms speech. In this speech, he talks about the four freedoms that everybody in the world deserves, those being the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Many took this speech as a hint that FDR indeed wanted to join the war and fight for democracy, that it was our role to stand up for these freedoms and rights for people all around the world, freedoms that did not exist within totalitarian regimes such as Nazi Germany. In 1940, Congress passes the Selective Service Act. This was America's first peacetime draft. So this shows that we are preparing ourselves for a potential attack once it is made obvious that we will continue to support the Allies, even though we are not technically in the war. We fear that there may be an attack against us. We're preparing ourselves for the possibility we may have to enter the war. Throughout the first couple of years of the war, we were indeed selling weapons to the Allies. It was done on a cash and carry basis, that they had to pay us cash and they had to transport the weapons on their own ships. But Great Britain is running out of money to continue fighting the war. They are the only country left standing against Nazi Germany. So they turn to us for help once again. FDR proposed an act that would allow Great Britain to borrow weapons if they return or paid for them after the war. All right. FDR said, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him a fire hose. You lend him yours and get it back once the fire is out. This was not a, I don't want to say popular. This was a controversial action. There was a lot of debate, a lot of people who are still isolationists that are afraid that this is going to bring us into the war. But eventually Congress does pass the Lend-Lease Act, and Hitler sees it as basically a declaration of war against the Axis powers, because it is at least an economic declaration of war against Nazi Germany. FDR tells Americans that the United States must become the great arsenal for democracy. That we must stand up to protect democracy around the world by providing the weapons and resources for the fight for democracy. Even though the people who want to intervene in the war are becoming more and more influential, more people are understanding that we may need to get involved, many people are still isolationist. Take a moment and look at this cartoon. How does this reflect the viewpoint and support the argument of isolationist? So what's going on in Japan? Well, obviously Japan is expanding throughout Asia. They are building their own empire. They view our U.S. presence as a threat in Asia. If you remember from the age of imperialism, we have several territories within the Pacific close to Japan. We are really the only nation left standing against Japanese expansion across the Pacific Rim. So our relationship is already not great with Japan, but then it declines even further when the United States places an embargo on Japan. This embargo is done in response to actions like the rape of Nanking, all of these terrible things that the Japanese are doing in their expansion across Asia. This embargo hit Japan really hard because they relied on the United States for scrap iron, steel, and 80% of their oil, things that they needed to continue their expansion, to continue their war across Asia. So we can see here, this cartoon shows us putting a kink in our supply of oil. That represents the embargo, cutting off fuel to the Japanese war machine. So, the action that ultimately brings the United States into World War II was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan wanted to fight back against the U.S. presence in the Pacific. Um, in order to do that, they attacked our U.S. naval bases um, at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. This was a surprise attack with no warning in the early hours of a Sunday morning, an attack that lasted for 3 hours. Um, the Japanese in this attack damaged 8 of our battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 160 aircrafts, and killed almost 2,500 Americans. However, they were unable to ultimately achieve their goal, which was to wipe out the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Instead, um, what they got was an angry United States who immediately declared war on Japan and entered the conflict of World War II. Here's a picture of the USS Arizona sinking at Pearl Harbor. Today it is a memorial that you can visit. They have openings in the floors. You can see down into the USS Arizona, which still lays on the sea floor. Some recreation images of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So on December 8th, 1941, the day after the attack at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan. FDR gave an address in which he called December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, in his speech asking Congress for a declaration of war. After we declare war on Japan on December 8th, 3 days later, Japan's allies, the other Axis powers, Germany and Italy, declare war on the United States. So now we will be fighting both in Japan and in Europe.